everybody. Welcome to our October Cyber Bytes webinar. We're thrilled to have you with us. My name is Liz Syka, and I'll be your host for today. I'm joined by our very own Jason Taylor, a senior cybersecurity analyst here at Sedara. Jason brings a wealth of experience in IT and cybersecurity, leading initiatives that strengthen organizational security through effective governance, policy design, and implementation. He holds multiple industry certifications, including CompTIA Network Plus, Security Plus, and Microsoft's AZ500. He has a strong background in both technical and strategic sides of cybersecurity. With this unique mix of hands-on experience and a master's degree in teaching and curriculum, Jason has a real talent for making complex cybersecurity concepts clear and actionable, which makes him the perfect person to guide us through today's session on identity and access management in Entra ID in Azure. Here's how today's session is going to flow. Jason will present for about 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a Q&A session where you can ask your questions in the Q&A panel, or just share things that come to mind. As for housekeeping, just a few quick notes before we begin. The session will be recorded, and we'll share the recording with you. If you have any technical issues, message us in the chat. As mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end, so submit your questions and we will not identify who you are, but if time permits, we will do our best to address them. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jason.
Thanks so much, Liz, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month. You know, before getting into cyber, October was always my favorite month. Leaves changing, apple cider, spooky season, right? And then, getting into cybersecurity now, October's even cooler because we get to just, pay more attention to cybersecurity in October. So fun times, and, just thanks for being here. We're going to do a really quick dive into how identity and access management works in Azure and Entra. This presentation is most applicable to organizations just starting out or expanding their Azure cloud footprint. So let's take a look at it. What are we going to be looking at? Well, we're really going to be looking at something called identity and access management. That is just the process for how an organization manages digital identities. We're talking about actual, policies, procedures, and technologies. Anything for how an organization manages identities. Why identities? Why are those important? We've probably all heard the phrase that identities are the new security perimeter, right? Gone are the days where all of your IT assets are in a single physical location with desktop computers, and the only way that your users access those is by coming into your physical location. We have data everywhere. We have people everywhere, and therefore our security perimeter is really most commonly our digital identities nowadays, and not just perimeter-based firewalls. This is really important because digital identities think of them as digital keys, right? Like your keys to your house. Well, they're really the keys to your digital world. And guess what? Malicious actors want those keys. The most common and effective cyber attacks, simple phishing, that's getting a digital identity, right? And so malicious actors want those keys. We need to secure our digital identities. How do we do it? Well, one way to think about identity and access management is this model, the IAAA model. I love this. It's really intuitive. And you should think about your identity and access management systems by which one of these IAAA items here it's fulfilling. So of course we have identification. That's where we're assigning a unique identity to a user, or it could be to a device or like a service account. First, we have to, assign the identity. Then we have to have that identity be able to authenticate. That's, of course, good old passwords and MFA, or we can use digital certificates or passwordless authentication, whatever it is. The identity must prove that they are who they say they are. That's authentication. Then we have to be able to authorize that identity to do a specific thing. Hopefully that thing is according to least privilege or role-based access control. We'll look specifically at how Entra and Azure fulfill least privilege and role-based access control later on. And lastly, once we authorize an identity to do something, we also want to do accounting. That's where we monitor our identities. Are they being used as intended? Is there any evidence of suspicious or malicious activity, right? So our identity and access management systems and solutions are always going to be doing at least one of these four things, and we have to be able to secure all four of them. And we'll look at how Azure solutions do this. What is the solution that does IAAA, identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting? It's commonly known as an identity provider or an IDP. There's many out there. It's a solution that does IAAA, and Active Directory Domain Services is the good old 25-year-old on-premises solution. But of course, we're going to be talking about Entra ID now for Azure's IDP. And then there's others. You can do AWS, Google, Okta, so on and so on, right? Lots of IDPs out there. So we have the background for identity and access management. It's really important. We can think about identity and access management through the IAAA model, the 4 steps, and we use an identity provider technology solution to manage our IAAA. Well, why is this important? Because identities are really hard to manage. We have complex technology environments, right? Maybe you're an organization with on-premises ADDS, and you've registered some apps with ADDS, but you also have some applications that aren't registered, and therefore you have users who are using their own identities for various apps or whatever. So now we have multiple identities going on, right? Some things centrally managed with identity provider, some things not. What about if you're an organization that has on-prem ADDS and you've synced ADDS with Entra ID because you have an M365 account, or you're starting to get into Azure? Well, now you've registered some apps with ADDS, and maybe you've registered some apps with Azure. So now you have different apps tied into different IDPs, and maybe you even have some Google Workspace stuff going on too. Gets complicated, right? At least simplest visually, maybe you're a cloud-first organization and you just have Entra ID, no on-prem ADDS, and you also have resources in Azure Cloud, and you've registered various applications with Entra ID. Visually easier to understand, but most organizations still have applications that are used by users, not managed by the IDP, just because it can be hard to register all your apps without your IDP to do SSO, single sign-on. Long story short, figure out what your technology stack looks like to solve this challenge, to make sure that we're fully managing our identities. So what is the solution then, before we dive explicitly into Azure and Entra? The solution is to try to use your IDP for as much as possible. Intentionally design your technology stack such that your IDP is at the forefront. Implement SSO where you can to ensure that authentication to various applications uses your IDP, and maintain a software asset inventory. What does that mean? Figure out, a software asset inventory, I'm using that term here to refer to, figure out whatever it is that you use to authenticate to or have identities for. Your software asset inventory should list all of those things, right? It could be 10 things, it could be 80 things that an organization uses. Try to track that stuff down. Figure out where authentication and identities occur so that you know what your blast radius and attack surface is for what could cause harm if your identities were compromised. Once we've centralized our IDP, we also want to follow procedures for joiners, movers, leavers, right? The identity management lifecycle. Make sure that when identities are created, it's through an official provisioning process. Not just anyone can create identities, right? We want to make sure that it's locked down, it's trackable, and it's auditable. Okay, oh my gosh, we've all attended this webinar. Why haven't you talked about Azure or Entra yet? I'm sorry, I'm a context guy. It takes me a long time to get to my point, which could be a strength or weakness depending on everyone's interests. But let's now dive into Azure and Entra for the rest of the time, now that we have a background, a theoretical understanding of identity and access management. So let's talk about Azure's IDP, which is Entra, formerly known as Azure Active Directory. Entra ID is the IDP backbone for all things Microsoft Cloud. It's for Azure, Intune, Microsoft 365. There are different license levels for it, and they all come with different features. If you're an organization that has M365, but no cloud resources beyond that, you have an Entra ID tenant. Entra ID comes with M365 and any resource that you put up into Azure. Entra ID is there in the background. So get to know, reflect on what you have, just M365. Do you have resources in Azure? Well, you have Entra, and we want to make sure that we're using it right. How does it compare to ADDS? For those familiar with Active Directory Domain Services, you remember, things about OUs and GPOs, forests and trusts. We know about Kerberos and LDAP, right? Well, Entra ID is different. It's not just a cloud Active Directory. No, it's an entirely different system. It uses different things. There's administrative units. It uses APIs. It uses totally different, authentication and authorization protocols and SAML, OpenID, and OAuth. So it's a separate IDP. How does it work though? What are two common approaches organizations have for using Entra? I kind of refer to them as the hybrid approach or the cloud first approach. So in the hybrid approach, you might have an on-premise AD, Active Directory Domain Services, and that's your primary IDP, where all of your identities are, initially created, right? But okay, you have an M365 account as well. Well, now you have Entra ID, and Entra now is effectively your secondary IDP. Maybe you sync ADDS with Entra. That means that your identities are provisioned, they're created in ADDS, but they're synchronized or copied up to Entra ID. That's not all identities, though. Some ADDS specific identities, the most important ones, arguably, like your domain administrator, those won't sync up to Entra by default. If you're using Microsoft Connect Sync or Cloud Sync for that syncing solution, those privileged identities by default won't sync up to Entra. That's a good thing because we want to, reduce our attack surface. The same in reverse. When you create your Entra, your Microsoft 365, identity, your new tenant is created, you get Entra, global administrator, effectively the domain admin for Entra. That does not sync down, nor should it, to ADDS. Same with other accounts to your hybrid identity administrator. So with this hybrid approach, you have your on-prem identities. Most sync up to Entra, but some are just on-prem identities or domain administrator. And the same with Entra, you might have cloud-specific identities as well, in addition to all of those that were synced over. You also have the cloud-first approach, and that's, of course, on-prem ADDS. This is simpler to understand. You're just using Entra. It's your primary IDP, and all of your identities are provisioned there. So do you get a sense how, if you're an organization thinking of working in Azure, you have ADDS, that's your primary IDP, but if you sync identities up into Entra, Entra is going to be used for authentication to M365 and Azure. Some identities are going to be just in on-prem, some just cloud first, but those synced identities will most likely be used for authenticating to Azure's cloud resources. Another way to look at this is with this graphic. There's kind of a lot going on here, but we have our on-prem ADDS environments. We have users, groups, devices, right? We're syncing that up into Entra. And that's where we get our synced users, groups, devices, but also we have some cloud native identities. And then Entra is used for authentication to M365 and to Azure. Maybe you have Azure, but not M365, or maybe you have M365 and not Azure. Well, if you have Azure, then we have, of course, the Azure hierarchy here. We have the tenant at the top. Everyone has a tenant if you have Entra M365 Azure, but just Azure has management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. And why I'm going over this hierarchy is because it's going to be important when we come to understand Azure RBAC, because Azure RBAC, role-based access control for Azure, we're going to be applying permissions, so authorization, at the various hierarchy for Azure here. So now I want to zoom in to really how roles and authorization work with both Entra and Azure. Now that we kind of understand, reflecting on what your current technology stack is, whether or not you're a cloud-first company, whether or not you're just an on-prem, ADDS company now, or most likely you're in some sort of hybrid, approach for a lot of organizations today. Well, if you want to start using Entra, more robustly or more securely, or putting more features in the cloud, it's really important that we understand how we assign roles in Entra. The nice thing about the cloud is that there's so many built-in roles in Entra. There's 144 built-in roles, very different than on-prem ADDS, right? We have the built-in roles that we want to figure out which users should get assigned to these roles for least privilege. I've listed some of the most common ones on the screen here, right? We have our global admin, the most privileged role, but then we have lots of other roles here. We should have very few global admins at your organization. Microsoft recommends having 5 or less global admins, and 2 of those are commonly also the break glass accounts, right? So not actually assigned to a specific user for daily use. We should really have a limited number of global admins. Anyone else who needs to do admin related work is hopefully using some other more least privilege role to manage your Azure environment. Well, how do we figure out what all these roles do? Oh my gosh, 144 different ones. How do we know, right? It's a lot. It can be tough. Thankfully, though, Microsoft provides a lot of different documentation for this. You can go to Microsoft Learn and look at all of the built-in roles in Entra. Here's the 144 different roles, and we can look at the different ones. Let's take a look at user administrator. Sounds like a common role that organizations would have, and this tells you everything that the user administrator can do. Note, creates users, disables or enables some users. Well, why can the user administrator disable or enable only some users? Let's figure it out. Microsoft provides good documentation for various sensitive activities that you can, look at here. And so, you can break this down and you can see essentially that the user administrator can't perform, disabling let's say global admins or privileged users. You would need a higher privileged role for that. How do you figure out least privilege for all of this stuff? Well, Microsoft also provides good documentation on least privilege roles by task. So if you have some sort of task, begin with the end in mind, right? You know what you want to have accomplished, but who should be assigned that role? You can kind of search and filter here by these different tasks. And let's say, users least privilege. If you want to figure out what's the least privileged role for someone to, create, delete a user, we have that user administrator again, right? So on and so on. Take 20 minutes, take half an hour, look around Entra ID's built-in roles and figure out who should have what. Global administrators are your most privileged. And then, we're off to the races for anything beneath that for who should be assigned what role. It's worth noting with Entra, though, that roles can be assigned at different scopes. So when we assign someone a role, we're really doing 3 things. We're figuring out who's going to be assigned it, that identity part of the IAAA model, right? What is the identity? A user, group, or service principal. Service principal is basically a service account. And then we have to assign the role. One of those 144 built-in roles, or of course we can create a custom role. And then we apply the role assignment at a specific scope. So tenant-wide, it's everything is open or a specific administrative unit. We won't get into that here, but it's a more granular way to assign an Entra role. And then you could also apply a role to a specific Entra resource, like a group or an application. So Entra roles, there's 144 of them. If you're just an M365 organization, you're going to probably assign things like the SharePoint administrator, the Teams administrator. Whereas if you're a full-fledged Azure organization, well, we're going to look at Azure RBAC in just a second. And I'm looking at time here. Oh my gosh, half an hour goes by so fast. So, forgive me, I do want to leave some time open for questions or pop them in the chat. But just a few more notes here on Entra, and I do want to quickly look at Azure RBAC. So best practices for Entra ID. there's so many here, right? I'm only including 4 on the slide, but be sure that when you assign roles that we're try to use something called role assignable groups as opposed to dynamic group membership. If you're using dynamic groups, it'll basically allows someone to escalate their privileges. Don't really have a ton of time to go into the granularity of that, but role assignable groups are a way to sort of lock down assignment of privileged roles to users via groups. Most commonly, organizations are going to want to apply roles to groups as opposed to specific users. So role assignable groups are a better solution than dynamic groups. Also, of course, monitor your most privileged roles. And be sure that we are remembering that we don't want our domain admins to sync up to Entra, and then our cloud-only administrator accounts, of course, are going to be cloud-only. There's a lot of other identity and access management solutions in Entra we're not going to talk about here. There's conditional access, that's huge. Self-service password reset, password deny lists, privilege identity management is also huge, and we can register specific applications in Entra for SSO, but that's certainly not a Cyber Bytes presentation. That's a cyber buffet, perhaps. So let's now turn our attention. The last part of the presentation is Azure RBAC. Okay, what is this? Well, we've talked about ADDS, we have identities, we have permissions there. We've talked about Entra. Entra is our IDP for the cloud. When we authenticate to M365 or to Azure, our identities and our authentication occurs via Entra. But with our Azure resources, our virtual machines, our storage accounts, our databases, whatever it is, Azure has its own RBAC system for authorization. Remember the IAAA model for authorization. Identities and authentication occurs in Entra, but the authorization for Azure resources occurs via Azure RBAC. Azure RBAC applies to just Azure resources, not Entra or M365. Similar to Entra, though, role assignment contains those 3 elements. We'll identify the security principal. Azure RBAC has 470 built-in roles now, as opposed to just Entra's 144. And note the difference in the scope. We can assign Azure RBAC roles to the hierarchy that we saw for Azure, the management groups, the subscriptions, the resource groups, and the resources. In general, Azure RBAC roles follow a 4-tier hierarchy, but this isn't a science. There's 470 roles. In general, we have things like owners, contributors, operators, and readers. Owners being the most privileged in general, and contributors a little bit less so, operators a little bit less so, and readers no privileges at all besides just to read. So there's a lot of roles in Azure. Here's just some of the Key Vault roles for Azure's Key Vault service, and you can see there's a whole bunch of different roles here for just Key Vault. How do we figure out which ones to assign people? Same steps, right? You can go to Azure's built-in roles here, and you can look at them all and search by your Azure solution, and then figure out exactly what they do. So it can be complicated. This takes planning. It's not just willy-nilly some admin I need this permission. You log into Azure and you click a button and someone gets it, right? You want to think about it and document it. And for the sake of time, let's start concluding here by just saying, so really quick Cyber Bytes presentation. I hope this is helpful. Again, really high level for organizations starting with Azure Identity and Access Management. Sedara can help with more detailed stuff. We can do consulting services to help you out. We can pen test your Microsoft environment. We can monitor your Microsoft environment, and then we can help to securely architect and design your Azure environment. So I want to leave 5 minutes open for questions. And again, just reflecting on identity and access management, really important. Figure out where you're at. Are you just on-prem? Are you hybrid? Are you full cloud? And then make sure you fully leverage the granular role-based access control features in Entra and Azure. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. I'm just going to give you guys a couple of minutes to put things into Q&A. Looks like we have one One question already submitted. It is, how can an organization align Entra ID and Azure rule management to ensure the right people have the right access and nothing more?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely just takes some planning. So it's hard to give general advice about this stuff because everyone's technology environment is different and their needs are different.
Mm.
I would start with your most privileged roles. Figure out what sorts of privileged users and privileged, activities you need to have done, and then assign those first. And hence, the answer isn't everyone needs global admin, of course. Um, Azure, it's great having this cloud environment with all these roles. It's really, I find it fun, but maybe it's fun to figure this out, like figure out what's the least granular way to assign these roles and document it, right? It can get really complicated too, especially if you're putting people in different groups and you might have like scope creep and whatnot, but it's a fun puzzle to solve, I think, and start with the most privileged roles and work down from there.
Yeah, with 144 roles, that is a cyber buffet. That was so funny. Gotta say, I actually laughed about that one. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So with that, thank you so much, Jason, for the presentation. It was really, really very informative. And thank you everybody for attending. If you haven't already, please sign up for next week's webinar, Password Policy, a history of getting it wrong and how to do it right in 2025, presented by our very own David Fryer. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a wonderful fall and take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.